In this video, I'll cover Mendelian inheritance patterns, focusing on a monohybrid cross. When Gregor Mendel performed his genetic crosses, we'll focus on the first type that he did, called a monohybrid cross. What does this mean? This means that whenever Mendel chose his parent plants to start his crosses, those plants would differ in only one character. So let's say that we start here in the P generation, so the beginning parents that Mendel was going to cross. He would choose one parent that only produced purple flowers, and he would cross that with an individual or breed it with an individual that only produced white flowers. These two plants right here represent the P generation. If we cross them, they will then produce what's called the F1 generation. What Mendel found is that all of the F1s turned out to be purple. If we then take two F1s and then breed them together, we'll then produce the F2 generation. And Mendel found them in this proportion. About 3/4 of the F2 offspring came out to be purple, whereas 1/4 of the F2 offspring came out to be white flowering plants. So this is interesting. You start with two parents of purple and white, but yet when they breed, you only get offspring with purple. So white seems to disappear here in the F1, but then the white trait shows up again in the F2. Mendel performed these experiments with many different traits: seed color, seed shape, pod color, flower color, etc. And what he found is that they all came out to be about the same ratio. He discovered this 3-to-1 ratio in these traits as he followed them through from the P, F1, and F2. The question is, why did it come out to be this way? So let's look at the genetics behind this. We'll start here in the P generation. Now I know these are represented with capital P's and lowercase p's. I'm going to replace these with purple being big A and white being little a. It's a little bit easier to recognize the capital and the lowercase example there. So in this case, the P generation, the purple flowering plant that you see here would be big A, and the white flowering plant that you see here would be little a, little a. So Mendel would take those, big A, and cross it with little a, to produce the F1 generation. And here what he found, they all turned out to be purple. Well, why? If you look at the genotype of the F1 offspring, they would all be big A, or heterozygous. Because they are carrying this big A, though, all of those offspring appear to be a purple flowering plant. This little a that's coding for the white color is kind of hidden. It's not being expressed. So then if we take a big A, little a individual and breed it with another big A, little a individual, we would get the F2 generation here. So what would we see if we cross this? Right, let me do a cross using a big A, little a heterozygous individual and another big A, little a heterozygous individual. Here in this square, we would get big A, big A. In this square, we would get big A, little a. In this square, we would get big A, little a. And then in this square, we would get little a, little a. Again, by doing this, I just go across and down. Okay? So what he found is that 3 out of the 4 were carrying this big A allele. And that's why 3 out of the 4 offspring appear to be purple, whereas only one of the potential offspring, or 1/4 of the potential offspring, are carrying 2 little a alleles, which then allow this original white flowering color to be expressed again in 1/4 of the potential offspring. Here are some different definitions that will be helpful to know. We have a gene. We'll start there. A gene is just going to be a piece of DNA that codes for a certain product, that product typically being a protein. An allele is going to be a variation of that gene, right? So again, if we go back to our example here, we could have this theoretical A gene, but there are 2 variations of that gene. We could have big A allele or little a allele. A dominant allele means that that particular trait will be expressed, whereas a recessive allele cannot be expressed if it's present with a dominant allele. And that's what we saw right here. If an individual is big A, little a, they would only be purple. The only way to express the recessive phenotype of white is to have 2 copies of a recessive allele, so little a, for example. Homologous. This means that that individual has 2 copies of the same allele. So we could have homozygous dominant, or we could have homozygous recessive. Heterozygous means that that individual carries 2 different copies. So big A, little a, for example. Genotype is the genetic makeup of the organism. So the genotype is listed like this, such as big A, little a, whereas the phenotype is the actual physical expression of that gene. So in this case, we would then say that if an individual is big A, little a, then their phenotype is purple. We have to remember that diploid organisms have 2 copies of each chromosome. We learned that these were called homologous chromosomes. So if I'm listing something like big A, little a, I'm saying, hey, on this chromosome they're carrying a big A, and on this chromosome they're carrying a little a at that location of flower color. What does this help us understand? We have to remember that diploid organisms, because they're carrying 2 copies of these chromosomes, they could be carrying different traits on those chromosomes, or different alleles that lead to those different traits. So if we look at this example here, let's say that I have brown eyes, but deep down in my genetics, I am a carrier for blue eyes that say that my dad gave to me. When going to produce eggs or sperm, so your gametes, we have to keep in mind that half of the time those gametes could be carrying blue eyes, and half of the time they could be brown eyes if this is what you were carrying in the beginning. So it's possible, for example, if I have brown eyes, but I'm a carrier for blue eyes, it's possible that I pass on one of these eggs to my offspring that would potentially give my child blue eyes. I also have the chance of passing on the trait to my child of having brown eyes. If an individual is crossed with another individual, but they are homozygous for different traits. So let's say that the first parent is big A, and the second parent is little a, right? After meiosis, which we've learned about before, we have to consider what would they be making here in their gametes. Well, this parent right here is only going to be passing on the allele for big A, whereas this parent right here is only going to be passing on the allele for little a. But when that egg and sperm come together, they make the zygote, which would be heterozygous, big A, little a. Right? Remember, this is explaining things like why then is the F1 all purple, and how can an F1 potentially pass on an offspring that has white flowering color if it seems like it disappeared here in the F1? Well, we have to remember that the F1, which are heterozygous, like this, big A, little a, although they are purple because of this dominant allele right here, they're still a carrier for this little a recessive allele that's coding for white flower color. So what does this help us understand? The first is Mendel's law of segregation. What this is saying is that a sperm or egg, aka the gamete, only carries one allele for each inherited character because allele pairs separate or segregate from each other during the production of gametes, which we can see happening here. These will separate and only pass down one particular character per allele each time that a gamete is made. 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. There's a video here if you need to look at that a little more. A few reminders. Each gamete is only carrying one allele because they separate through meiosis. So in a heterozygous individuals, we would have two different alleles that segregate into equal proportions in the gametes like we see here. In this case, our proportion in the gametes would be 1/2 are carrying blue and 1/2 are carrying brown, right? So equal proportions because they separate in this way. Okay. All right, so that's a summary of a monohybrid cross. We'll move forward with more material in the next video.